The clock on the wall read 8:47 p.m. when David pushed his cleaning cart through the back entrance of the Preston Concert Hall. His shoulders ached from the long day, but he didn't mind. This place had become more than just a job to him over the past 3 years. It was the closest he could get to the music that once filled his entire life. At 42 years old, David had learned to be invisible. The wealthy people who attended concerts here never looked at him twice. To them, he was just another worker in a gray uniform, someone who existed only to keep their world clean and perfect. And honestly, he preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. It meant not having to explain why a man his age was mopping floors instead of doing something more important with his life. Tonight was different, though. The main hall buzzed with energy. A private charity event was taking place, and from what David had overheard, some very rich and powerful people were attending. He'd been instructed to stay in the back areas until the event ended, then clean the hall once everyone left. He parked his cart near the stage entrance and pulled out his phone. His daughter had sent him a video of his grandson playing with blocks. David smiled, his heart warming at the sight. This was why he did what he did. The money he sent home every month made a real difference for his family back in the Philippines. They didn't need to know that their father and grandfather spent his nights scrubbing toilets and mopping marble floors. The sound of laughter echoed from the main hall. David peeked through the side curtain, curious about what was happening. The stage held a beautiful grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Around 50 people in expensive suits and elegant dresses stood in small groups, champagne glasses in hand. A woman stood near the piano, commanding everyone's attention. She wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than David made in 6 months. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek style, and she held herself with the kind of confidence that only came from having more money than most people could imagine. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the chatter, "I have a proposal that should make this evening more entertaining." The crowd quieted down, turning to face her. David noticed several young men straightening their ties, clearly trying to impress her. "As many of you know, I play piano as a hobby," she continued, "and I've always believed that true talent is incredibly rare. So here's my challenge." She paused for dramatic effect, a slight smile playing on her lips. "Anyone here who can play the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 perfectly? And I mean absolutely perfectly. I will marry them on the spot." The hall erupted in laughter and excited whispers. Several men immediately stepped forward, eager to take the challenge. David shook his head slightly. He knew that piece well, very well. It was one of the most difficult piano compositions ever written, requiring not just technical skill but years of dedicated practice and natural talent. The woman, whose name David learned was Victoria, sat at the piano. "Let me demonstrate what I'm looking for," she said. Her hands moved across the keys and the opening notes of the concerto filled the hall. She was good, David had to admit. Better than good, actually. She played with precision and confidence, hitting every note clearly. But something was missing. David could hear it immediately. The technical execution was there, but the soul wasn't. She played it like someone who had learned it from a book, not someone who understood the pain and beauty that Rachmaninoff had poured into every measure. The first volunteer, a man in his 30s with perfectly styled hair, sat at the piano with swagger. He made it through maybe 8 bars before his fingers stumbled over the rapid passages. The crowd politely applauded anyway as he stood up, his face red. "Next," Victoria called out, clearly enjoying herself. 3 more men tried. Each one failed within the first minute, their confidence crumbling as the piece's difficulty became apparent. The crowd's laughter grew louder with each attempt. It was all a game to them, David realized. A way for rich people to entertain themselves and show off. He turned away from the curtain, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. Once upon a time, he would have walked onto that stage without hesitation. Once upon a time, his fingers could have danced across those keys and brought that piece to life in a way that would have left everyone speechless. But that was another life. A life that ended when his father got sick and the hospital bills started piling up. A life that disappeared when he had to choose between his dreams and his family's survival. The choice had been easy, even if the consequences had been hard to live with. David pulled out his earbuds and started his evening playlist. Music helped him work, helped him remember that even though he couldn't perform anymore, the sound still lived inside him. He began mopping the backstage area, letting the classical pieces in his ears transport him away from the reality of his situation. By the time the party finally ended around 11, David had cleaned most of the back areas. He waited patiently as the guests filed out, their laughter and conversation fading into the night. Finally, the hall grew quiet. He pushed his cart onto the stage, ready to begin the final cleaning. That's when he noticed her. Victoria was still there, sitting alone at the piano. Her confident demeanor from earlier had softened into something more thoughtful. She played quietly now, a Chopin nocturne that filled the empty space with gentle melancholy. David worked silently, trying not to disturb her. He'd learned over the years how to be quiet, how to do his job without interrupting the important people. He carefully mopped around the piano, keeping his movements smooth and soundless. She finished the piece and stood up, gathering her things. David noticed she'd left a silk scarf on the piano bench. Expensive, probably designer. He waited until she walked toward the exit before moving to pick it up. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out. "You forgot something," but she'd already gone through the door. David held the scarf, debating whether to run after her or just leave it at the lost and found. He set it carefully on the piano bench and turned to leave. His hand accidentally brushed against the keys. The simple touch sent a jolt through him like touching a live wire. How long had it been since he'd really played? The upright piano in his apartment building's basement was old and out of tune. It wasn't the same as a professional instrument like this. Just one phrase, he told himself, just to remember what it felt like. His fingers found their positions automatically, muscle memory taking over after years of dormancy. He played the opening phrase of the Rachmaninoff, the same piece from earlier. But when his hands moved, something magical happened. The notes didn't just sound, they sang. Each phrase connected to the next with the kind of emotional depth that couldn't be taught, only felt. "Wait." David's hands froze above the keys. His heart dropped into his stomach. Victoria stood in the aisle, her scarf forgotten. She must have come back for it and heard him playing. He stood up quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have touched it." "I was just, play that again," she interrupted. Her voice had lost its earlier arrogance. Now it carried something else. Surprise, wonder, disbelief. David looked at her, then at the piano, then back at her. This could cost him his job. But the way she was looking at him, not through him like usual, but actually at him, made him pause. "Please," she added, taking a step closer. "I need to hear that again." David's hands trembled slightly as they hovered over the piano keys. Every instinct told him to apologize again, grab his mop and disappear into the back rooms where he belonged. But Victoria hadn't moved. She stood there in the aisle, her expensive heels clicking softly as she took another step closer to the stage. "I could lose my job," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You won't," Victoria replied. Her tone had changed completely from the cocky challenge she'd thrown out earlier. "I own half the board of directors. Just play." David took a deep breath. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. When was the last time someone had actually wanted to hear him play? When was the last time someone had looked at him like he was more than just the invisible man who cleaned up after everyone else? His fingers touched the keys and suddenly the last 20 years melted away. The concert hall, the mop bucket, the gray uniform, none of it mattered anymore. There was only the music. He started from the beginning of the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto. The opening melody flowed from his fingers like water, each note perfectly placed but filled with something deeper than technical accuracy. His hands moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who hadn't performed in years. The rapid passages that had defeated the wealthy men earlier became effortless under his touch. But it wasn't just the speed or the accuracy that made it special. David played with his whole body, his whole heart. He swayed slightly with the melody, his eyes closed, completely lost in the music. Every phrase told a story of loss, of hope, of dreams that never died even when life tried to bury them. Victoria walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage. Her mouth had fallen open slightly, and she seemed to have forgotten how to close it. She'd heard this piece performed by professionals countless times. She'd even paid thousands of dollars for private lessons with renowned pianists, but she'd never heard anything like this. The music built to the first climax, David's hands flying across the keys with impossible speed. Then it softened into the tender secondary theme, and somehow his playing became even more beautiful. Each note seemed to hang in the air, perfectly weighted before dissolving into the next. When he finally finished the opening section, silence filled the hall. David kept his hands on the keys for a moment, his eyes still closed, reluctant to return to reality. Then he slowly opened them and looked down at his weathered hands, surprised by what they'd just done. Victoria had reached the stage. She stood just a few feet away, staring at him like she'd just witnessed something impossible. "Who are you?" she whispered. David stood up from the piano bench, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. His gray janitor's uniform had sweat stains under the arms. His shoes were old and scuffed. His hands, though they'd just created something beautiful, were rough and calloused from years of manual labor. "I'm nobody," he said, reaching for his mop. "Just the janitor." "I really shouldn't have." "That's not what I meant," Victoria interrupted. "I mean, who are you really? Where did you learn to play like that?" David hesitated. He never talked about his past. What was the point? It only made the present hurt more. But something about the way she asked, with genuine curiosity instead of pity, made him pause. "Can I buy you a coffee?" Victoria asked. "There's a machine in the staff room. Please, I need to understand what I just heard." 20 minutes later, they sat in the empty staff break room on plastic chairs that had seen better days. David held a paper cup of terrible vending machine coffee, while Victoria sat across from him with her own cup, which she hadn't touched. "I grew up in Manila," David began, his voice soft. "Music was everything in my family. My mother sang in the church choir. My father played guitar. They noticed I had something special when I was 5 years old. I could hear a song once and play it back perfectly." Victoria leaned forward, listening intently. "By the time I was 10, I was winning competitions. At 15, I performed with the Manila Symphony Orchestra. When I was 19, I got accepted to Juilliard in New York, full scholarship." David smiled at the memory, though his eyes held sadness. "My parents were so proud. They threw a party for the whole neighborhood." "What happened?" Victoria asked gently. David took a sip of his coffee, buying time. These weren't easy memories to share. 3 months before I was supposed to leave for New York, my father had a stroke. A bad one. He survived, but he couldn't work anymore. Couldn't even walk without help. He stared down at his cup. The hospital bills started coming. Physical therapy, medications, special equipment. My mother worked double shifts at the hospital where she was a nurse, but it wasn't enough. My younger sister was still in school. Someone had to help. "So you gave up Juilliard?" Victoria said softly. "I didn't see it as giving up," David replied. "I saw it as choosing family. That's what you do, right? You take care of the people you love." He looked up at her. "I stayed home. Taught piano lessons to kids in the neighborhood. Played at hotels and restaurants. Weddings sometimes. It wasn't Carnegie Hall, but it paid the bills." Victoria watched him carefully. "But you're here now. In America. What changed?" David's expression grew darker. "My father passed away 5 years after his stroke. By then, the medical debt had grown so big we lost our house. Everything we owned went to pay what we could. My mother moved in with my sister. I realized I was just another burden, another mouth to feed." He set down his coffee cup. "A friend told me about work opportunities in America. I came here thinking maybe I could make enough money to send home, help them rebuild. I was 36 years old with no American credentials, no references, no connections. The only jobs I could get were cleaning offices, washing dishes, things like that. You never tried to go back to music professionally?" Victoria asked. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Have you ever applied for anything? They ask for your work history, your education credentials, your references. On paper, I'm just a middle-aged immigrant with a high school diploma who cleans buildings. No conservatory is going to take that seriously. No orchestra would even let me audition." He gestured at his uniform. "People see this and they've already decided who I am and what I'm worth. They don't hear the music. They just see the mop." Victoria sat back in her chair, quiet for a long moment. David could see emotions playing across her face. Shame, maybe. Realization. She'd spent the entire evening making a joke out of talent, turning it into entertainment for bored rich people. And here sat someone with more natural ability than anyone in that room, invisible because of a uniform. "Do you still play?" she finally asked. "There's an old piano in my apartment building's basement," David said. "The landlord lets me use it after midnight when nobody's around to complain about the noise. It's out of tune and half the keys stick, but it's something." He smiled slightly. "Music doesn't leave you even when everything else does." Victoria stood up abruptly. "Come with me." "What, where?" "Back to the stage." She was already walking toward the door. I need to hear you play the rest of that piece. All of it, David followed her, confused. It's almost midnight. Don't you need to go home? She turned to look at him. I've spent the last 5 years of my life building tech companies, making money, collecting things. And tonight a janitor just showed me what real wealth actually sounds like. So no, I don't need to go home. I need to hear you play. They walked back into the empty concert hall together. David sat at the grand piano again, but this time felt different. The hall was completely empty now, just the two of them under the soft stage lights. Victoria had taken a seat in the front row, her designer dress looking oddly out of place in the vacant concert hall. Play whatever you want, she said. Not for a challenge, not for a joke. Just play for yourself. David's fingers found the keys again. This time he didn't choose Rachmaninoff. Instead, he started with something simpler, something that meant more to him personally. A Filipino lullaby his mother used to sing. He'd arranged it for piano years ago, weaving the simple melody into something more complex while keeping its heart intact. The music filled the space with warmth. It spoke of home, of family, of sacrifice and love. David played with his eyes closed, seeing his mother's face, hearing her voice singing to him as a child. When he finished, he looked up to find Victoria wiping her eyes. That was beautiful, she said, her voice thick with emotion. What was it? Just something from home, David replied. Something that reminds me why I do what I do. Victoria stood and walked up to the stage, sitting on the edge with her legs dangling, not caring about her expensive dress. Can I ask you something honest? Sure. Are you angry? She asked. About how things turned out? You should be playing in concert halls, teaching at prestigious schools, recording albums. Instead, you're mopping floors. Doesn't that make you furious? David thought about it for a moment. Sometimes, he admitted. Late at night when I can't sleep, I think about what might have been. But anger doesn't change anything. It just makes the present harder to bear. He turned on the piano bench to face her. My daughter finished nursing school last year. My grandson is healthy and happy. My mother has a good home with my sister. Every month when I send money back, I know it makes their lives better. Would I trade their happiness for my own dreams? Never. That's incredibly noble, Victoria said quietly. It's not noble. It's just love, David smiled. Besides, I still have music. Maybe not the way I imagined, but it's still there. Every night when I play that old piano in the basement, I'm rich in a way that has nothing to do with money. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, less confident than before. I made a fool of myself tonight, didn't I? That whole challenge, treating music like a party trick. You were just having fun, David said diplomatically. No, I was showing off. Victoria corrected herself. I was using my money and my position to feel superior. And the universe decided to humble me by putting real talent right in front of my face, wearing a janitor's uniform where I'd never think to look. She stood up and paced the stage. I've spent the last 10 years building my company from nothing. I worked 100-hour weeks, sacrificed relationships, missed birthdays and holidays. I told myself it was all worth it, because I was creating something important. But you know what? Tonight, your 10-minute performance of a lullaby moved me more than anything I've built. David didn't know what to say to that. Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him directly. I want to help you. Not charity, not pity. I want to help you get back to music professionally. Whatever you need, recordings, auditions, proper credentials, connections. I have resources. Let me use them for something meaningful. David's stomach tightened. He'd heard promises before. Well-meaning people who said they'd help, who got excited about his story, then disappeared when they realized how complicated it actually was. That's kind of you, but before you say no, just listen, Victoria interrupted. I know what you're thinking. Rich person trying to soothe their conscience. But that's not this. What I heard tonight, that level of talent doesn't come around often. It would be a crime to let the world never hear it just because life was unfair to you. And what do you get out of it? David asked, unable to keep the skepticism from his voice. Victoria sat back down on the stage edge. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe just the feeling that I did something worthwhile with all this money I've made. Maybe the chance to learn from someone who actually understands what it means to have passion for something beyond profit margins. She looked at him earnestly. I told you I play piano as a hobby. Truth is, I've had the best teachers money can buy. I've practiced for years, but I play like someone following instructions in a manual. You play like music is the language you think in. I want to understand that. I want to learn how to put soul into the notes instead of just hitting them correctly. David studied her face. She seemed genuine, but he'd been disappointed before. I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept handouts. I've built my life on working for what I have. Then don't think of it as a handout, Victoria said quickly. Think of it as a trade. You teach me to play with feeling, really play, not just perform, and I'll help you get the opportunities you deserve. Consider it a business arrangement if that makes it easier. Despite himself, David felt a small spark of hope igniting in his chest. He tried to tamp it down, tried to be realistic, but it had been so long since anyone had seen him as a musician instead of just the cleaning guy. I work 6 nights a week, David said slowly. I send almost all my money home to my family. I can't just stop doing that. You wouldn't have to, Victoria replied. Keep your job while we work on this. We can practice late at night after your shift. I'll arrange auditions, help you record some pieces properly. Nothing happens overnight anyway, but at least we'd be moving in the right direction. David wanted to say yes. Every fiber of his being wanted to say yes, but years of disappointment had taught him caution. Why are you really doing this? He asked again. Please be honest with me. Victoria was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer than before. My father died 2 years ago. He was a music teacher in a public school, worked there for 35 years, made maybe $40,000 a year. I always thought he wasted his potential, you know? I'd tell him he should do something more ambitious, make more money. She looked down at her hands. At his funeral, hundreds of people came. Former students, some of them 50 years old, traveled across the country to be there. They stood up and told stories about how my father had changed their lives, how he'd seen potential in them when nobody else did, how he'd stayed late after school to give them free lessons because their families couldn't afford private teachers. Victoria's eyes were wet again. I realized I'd spent my whole life measuring worth the wrong way. My father touched hundreds of lives. He made the world better in ways that can't be measured in dollars. And I'd dismissed all of that because he wasn't rich. She looked up at David. When I heard you play tonight, I heard what my father always tried to tell me. That real value isn't about money or status. It's about the things we create, the ways we touch other people's lives. You have a gift that deserves to be shared, not because it will make you rich, but because it will make the world richer. David felt his resistance crumbling. Maybe this was different. Maybe this was real. I have one condition, he said finally. Name it. I stay who I am. I keep working. I keep taking care of my family. This doesn't become some story about a billionaire saving a poor janitor. We do this as equals, or we don't do it at all. Victoria stood and extended her hand. Deal. Partners, not charity case and benefactor. You teach me to play with soul. I help you get the platform you deserve. David stood and shook her hand. Her grip was firm, businesslike. When do we start? He asked. Tomorrow night, Victoria said with a smile. After your shift. And David? Thank you for reminding me what actually matters. As he walked home that night, David felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but possibility. 3 weeks had passed since that night, and David's life had settled into a strange new rhythm. He still worked his regular shifts, mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms. But now, 3 nights a week after midnight, Victoria would arrive at the concert hall with coffee and pastries, ready for their sessions together. You're tensing up again, David said gently, watching Victoria's shoulders as she tried to work through a Chopin piece. Music isn't a battle you have to win. It's a conversation you're having. Victoria stopped playing and flexed her fingers. That's easy for you to say. You make it look effortless. It's not effortless. It's trust. David moved to stand beside the piano. You're so focused on playing every note perfectly that you forget to listen to what you're creating. The music knows where it wants to go. Your job is to follow it, not control it. I'm not good at following, Victoria admitted with a wry smile. I'm better at leading. I've noticed, David said, and they both laughed. The truth was, their arrangement was working better than either of them had expected. Victoria was a quick learner, and more importantly, she was humble enough to actually listen. She'd shown up that first night with a notebook full of questions and a willingness to start from the basics. And David had to admit, teaching felt good. Really good. It reminded him of his early days in Manila, working with neighborhood kids who couldn't afford formal lessons. There was something pure about sharing music with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. Okay, try it again, David said. But this time close your eyes. Don't think about your hands. Think about what the music is saying. Victoria closed her eyes and placed her hands on the keys. She started the Chopin Nocturne again, and this time something shifted. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing slowed. The notes began to flow instead of march. There, David said softly. That's it. You hear the difference? Victoria finished the phrase and opened her eyes, looking genuinely surprised. I felt it. It was like the piano was playing itself and I was just helping. Exactly. David smiled. That's what music is supposed to feel like. Victoria stood up from the bench, energized. Your turn. I want to hear what you've been working on. Over the past weeks, Victoria had been using her connections quietly, just as she'd promised. She'd reached out to a friend who ran a recording studio and arranged for David to lay down some tracks, professional recordings he could submit to competitions and auditions. But she'd been careful to keep her involvement hidden, letting David's talent speak for itself. David sat at the piano and pulled out some sheet music he'd been carrying in his backpack. I've been working on something original, a piece about my mother. You composed too? Victoria asked, surprised. Just for myself. Nothing fancy. David felt suddenly self-conscious. Playing other people's music was one thing. Sharing his own felt more vulnerable somehow. But he began to play, and the notes that filled the hall were unlike anything Victoria had heard from him before. The melody was simple but deeply emotional, weaving between major and minor keys like someone caught between joy and sadness. It spoke of distance and longing, of love that persisted across oceans and years. When David finished, Victoria was quiet for a long moment. That's not just for yourself, she finally said. That needs to be heard. That needs to be recorded. David shook his head. Original compositions from an unknown pianist? Nobody's going to care about that. Stop doing that, Victoria said firmly. Stop deciding what you're worth before giving the world a chance to respond. Before David could answer, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out and saw a message from his daughter. His face went pale as he read it. What's wrong? Victoria asked immediately. David's hands were shaking. My mother. She fell and broke her hip. They're saying she needs surgery, but it's expensive. The insurance only covers part of it. He stood up abruptly, pacing the stage. I need to send more money. I need to pick up extra shifts somewhere. Maybe I can find weekend work, or how much do you need? Victoria asked. No, David said immediately, turning to face her. We had a deal. This stays equal. I won't take your money. David, your mother needs help. And I'll help her the same way I always have. By working. His voice was firm despite the fear in his eyes. I appreciate everything you've done, but I can't start depending on your money. That's not who I am. Victoria started to argue, then stopped herself. She understood pride. She understood the need to stand on your own. Okay, she said quietly. But let me make some calls. I know people who need piano teachers, people who would pay well for private lessons. You could do that on your days off. It's still your work, your talent, just better paying than mopping floors. David hesitated. I don't have a studio or proper credentials. You have something better. You have real ability. Victoria pulled out her phone. I have a friend whose daughter wants to learn piano. She's been looking for a teacher who can work with her schedule. Let me set up a trial lesson. If it doesn't work out, fine. But at least try. David wanted to say no. He wanted to keep his life simple. Keep the walls up that protected him from disappointment. But his mother needed surgery and pride didn't pay medical bills. One trial lesson, he agreed. But if this becomes charity disguised as teaching, I'm out. Deal, Victoria said. The next week moved fast. Victoria arranged not just one trial lesson, but 3, with families willing to pay $50 an hour for quality instruction. David taught after his day shifts, before his evening work at the concert hall. He was exhausted, but the extra money meant he could cover his mother's surgery costs. And something unexpected happened. He loved teaching again. The kids he worked with responded to his patient approach, his ability to make complex concepts simple. Word spread, and soon he had a waiting list. But the real breakthrough came on a Thursday night. Victoria arrived at the concert hall holding a tablet, her face flushed with excitement. What happened? David asked, seeing her expression. The recordings we made. I submitted them to the International Piano Competition under a pseudonym, just to see what would happen. Victoria turned the tablet to show him an email. David, you made it through the first round. They want you to audition live. David's heart stopped. The international piano competition was one of the most prestigious in the world. Winners got concert contracts, recording deals, and instant credibility in the classical music world. "I can't," he said immediately. "I have work. I have students now. I can't just—" "The audition is in 6 weeks," Victoria interrupted. "On a Sunday. You don't work Sundays. They'll see me. They'll know I'm just a janitor. They'll know I'm not— They'll know you're a pianist," Victoria said firmly. "That's all they need to know. When you sit at that piano, your uniform doesn't matter. Your job doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what comes out when you touch those keys." David sat down heavily on the edge of the stage. This was too much, too fast. 6 weeks ago, he was invisible. Now someone was telling him he might have a shot at one of the biggest competitions in the classical music world. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. Victoria sat beside him. "Good, that means it matters. That means you still care. What if I fail? What if I get there and freeze up or mess up or they laugh at me? What if you don't?" Victoria countered. "What if you get there and remind them what music is supposed to sound like? What if you show them that talent doesn't care about your tax bracket or your job title?" David looked at her. Over these weeks, she'd become more than just someone helping him. She'd become a friend. Maybe the first real friend he'd made since coming to America. "Will you be there?" he asked. "At the audition?" Victoria smiled. "Try to keep me away." David took a deep breath. "Okay, I'll do it. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Whether I succeed or fail, we keep doing this. The late-night sessions, the teaching you music, all of it. This isn't just about one competition. This is about remembering who I am." Victoria put her hand on his shoulder. "Win or lose, we're in this together. You have my word." That night after Victoria left, David stayed at the piano for an extra hour. He played through the pieces he'd need to perform for the audition. His fingers were tired, his back ached, and he had to be at his day job in 6 hours. But for the first time in 20 years, David felt like a musician again. Not despite being a janitor, but in addition to it. All the parts of his life were finally coming together, and maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning of the audition arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that cut through David's jacket as he stood outside Carnegie Hall. He'd been here before, of course, but only to clean a corporate event in the lobby years ago. He'd never imagined walking through the front entrance as a performer. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd barely slept the night before, running through the pieces in his mind over and over, terrified he'd forget something crucial. The other contestants filing into the building looked exactly like what he'd expected. Young, confident, dressed in expensive concert attire. Most of them probably had degrees from Juilliard or Curtis or some other prestigious conservatory. And then there was David, 42 years old in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit right, carrying a folder of sheet music with coffee stains on the edges. "You look like you're about to be sick." David turned to find Victoria walking toward him, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She wore a simple blue dress and had her hair down, looking more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "I don't belong here," David said quietly. "Look at these people. They're professionals. I'm just— If you say just a janitor one more time, I'm going to spill this coffee on you," Victoria interrupted, handing him one of the cups. "You belong here because your talent earned you this spot. Now drink your coffee and remember why you're doing this." David took a sip, grateful for something to do with his hands. "My daughter called this morning. My mother is doing well after her surgery. She wanted to know why I sounded nervous. Did you tell her?" "I told her I had an important meeting." David smiled weakly. "She'd never believe me if I said I was auditioning at Carnegie Hall." "Well, after today you can tell her the truth." Victoria checked her watch. "You should head in. They're starting soon." David nodded but didn't move. "Victoria, I need to say something. These past 6 weeks, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. Whatever happens today, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Victoria said with a smile. "Thank me when you nail this audition and show these people what real music sounds like." Inside, David checked in at the registration desk. The woman there barely looked at him, just handed him a number and pointed toward the waiting area. Number 17. He'd be somewhere in the middle of the lineup. The waiting room was full of nervous energy. Young pianists practiced fingerings on their knees. Others sat with eyes closed, headphones in. A few were stretching their hands and wrists. David found a seat in the corner and tried to steady his breathing. He watched as contestants were called one by one. Through the thick doors, he could sometimes hear muffled music. Some performances drew murmurs of appreciation. Others ended in polite, brief applause. Number 17. David's heart jumped into his throat. This was it. He stood, grabbed his folder, and walked toward the stage door. His legs felt like they might give out any second. The stage was smaller than he'd imagined, but somehow more intimidating. A beautiful Steinway grand piano sat in the center, and beyond it, 3 judges sat at a long table with notepads and stern expressions. The house lights were dim, but David could see Victoria sitting in the 5th row, giving him an encouraging nod. "Your name?" one of the judges asked, not looking up from his papers. "David Santos. And you'll be performing?" The judge's tone was bored, like he'd heard 100 auditions already and expected nothing special from number 17. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, opening section, and Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, opus 9, number 2. The judge waved his hand dismissively. "Proceed." David sat at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. His hands were still shaking as he placed them on the keys. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. All those years of practice, all those midnight sessions in the apartment basement, all those dreams he'd buried, it all came down to this moment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he thought about his mother, recovering in Manila, his daughter, who'd worked so hard to finish nursing school, his grandson, who deserved to know his grandfather was more than just a man who sent money home every month. And he thought about Victoria, who'd looked past his uniform and seen who he really was. David's fingers touched the keys, and everything else disappeared. The Rachmaninoff flowed from his hands like it had been waiting years to be released. Every note was exactly where it needed to be, but more than that, every phrase told a story. The rapid passages that had defeated so many others became effortless. The tender moments sang with a depth that only comes from understanding real loss and real hope. He didn't play it like someone trying to impress judges. He played it like someone who'd lived inside this music for decades, who understood that Rachmaninoff had poured his own struggles and triumphs into every measure. When he finished the Rachmaninoff section and moved into the Chopin, the mood shifted entirely. The Nocturne was gentler, more intimate. David played it like a conversation with someone he loved, each phrase a tender thought expressed in sound instead of words. In the audience, one of the judges had finally looked up from his papers. His expression changed from bored to alert. The other 2 were leaning forward, watching David's hands with growing interest. When the final notes of the Chopin faded into silence, David kept his hands on the keys for a moment, reluctant to let go. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the judges. The silence stretched out. David couldn't read their expressions. Maybe he'd messed up somewhere. Maybe his technique wasn't polished enough. Maybe, "Mr. Santos," the middle judge said, his voice different now, engaged. "Where did you study?" David's throat was dry. "Manila Conservatory of Music, sir. But I didn't complete my degree." "And your current teacher?" This was it. The moment where he'd be exposed as a fraud. "I don't have one, sir. I teach myself." The judges exchanged glances. The one on the left made a note on his paper. David's heart sank. This was where they'd thank him politely and send him on his way. "That will be all for today," the middle judge said. "Results will be posted next week." David stood, gave a small bow, and walked off stage on legs that barely supported him. He'd done his best. That would have to be enough. In the lobby, Victoria was waiting with a huge smile. "David, that was incredible. Did you see their faces? They were completely absorbed." "They didn't say anything," David replied, his voice flat. "Just that they'd post results next week. That's good news. They'd tell you right away if you didn't make it through." David wanted to believe her, but years of disappointment had taught him not to hope too much. "I should get home. I have work tomorrow morning." "David, stop. Just for one moment, stop thinking about what comes next and recognize what you just did. You performed at Carnegie Hall. You played like a master. You proved you belong in that world." David looked at her, and some of the tension in his chest loosened. "You're right. Whatever happens, I did it. I really did it." They walked out into the afternoon sunlight together. David's phone buzzed. A text from his daughter with a photo of his mother, smiling from her hospital bed, her thumb up. "Everything okay?" Victoria asked. "Yeah," David said, smiling for the first time that day. "Everything's okay." The next week moved slowly. David went back to his regular routine, work and teaching and late-night practice sessions. He tried not to think about the competition, but it was impossible not to wonder. On Thursday evening, he was mopping the Preston concert hall when Victoria burst through the doors waving her phone. "David, check your email now." He pulled out his phone with wet hands, nearly dropping it. There in his inbox was a message from the International Piano Competition. He clicked it open, his vision blurring as he read. "I made it," he whispered. "I made it to the finals." Victoria let out a shout of joy that echoed through the empty hall. I told you they'd see what I saw." But there was more. Another email underneath. An invitation to perform as a guest artist with the City Symphony Orchestra. And another from a recording studio interested in producing an album of his original compositions. David stared at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. His whole life was changing in the space of a few emails. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "How did this happen?" "Talent happened," Victoria said firmly. "Hard work happened. You happened?" David looked around the concert hall where he'd spent 3 years being invisible. The mop bucket sat where he'd left it, a reminder of where he'd been. But it didn't define him anymore. It never had. "I'm still going to keep this job," David said suddenly. Victoria looked surprised. "What? Why?" "Because it's part of my story. Because it taught me that work has dignity no matter what form it takes. Because I don't ever want to forget what it's like to be invisible, so I never make anyone else feel that way." He smiled at Victoria. "Besides, someone has to keep this place clean." Victoria laughed and shook her head. "You're impossible." "No," David corrected her gently. "I'm just exactly who I'm supposed to be. A father, a son, a teacher, a musician, and yes, a janitor too, all of it together." 6 months later, David stood backstage at his debut concert. He wore a proper tuxedo this time, and his hands were steady. In the audience sat his daughter and grandson, flown in from the Philippines. His mother watched via video call from Manila, too frail to travel but beaming with pride. And in the front row sat Victoria, who'd become not just a friend, but a